Hello and welcome to another lesson with Rivera Fine Art Studios. Today I wanted to discuss a little bit of a different pastel technique. This is a technique where I'll be wetting the pastel to create more smooth and saturated color. So the first step is to just apply the pastel dry as you see me doing right now, and then I will go over this with a wet brush. For materials, I am using an Arches cold press watercolor paper. So it does have a little bit of tooth and texture. And then I will be using New Pastel soft pastels, which are chalky, unlike oil pastels, which are a little bit waxy. So this will blend very nicely with water, and it will also blend dry. The beauty of this technique is once I apply the water, I can then go over top of it again with dry pastel and continue to modify the color, creating more saturation and more variation. So as you can see now, that first layer is still kind of greeny, but what I'm doing right now is going over it with a slightly damp chisel blender brush. And I can control how diluted I make this color by how much water I have on my brush. And this is not soaking wet, it's just a little bit damp. And if I need to add more water, I can do so. And what is really nice about this technique is these colors will get fixed to the paper. Once the water dries, these will be permanent colors. So as I continue to layer additional colors over this, it won't blend with what is underneath. So at this moment, I am just continuing to blend and smooth out my layers. And I've chosen fairly neutral colors, so I'm working with earthy browns and yellows and pinks. And I always find it very fun to experiment with materials and try to discover techniques that maybe combine elements of painting and drawing. I do love working with oil paint, and to me this is sort of similar to that, starting off with sort of limited color, establishing the values, and then continuing to layer on top of it with brighter and more vivid colors. And this is very much how I would approach an oil painting. Of course, this is also very similar to a watercolor. Essentially, it is a watercolor. I am just using dry pigment and applying that to the paper and then adding the water versus a traditional watercolor where I would be adding water to my paints and then applying it to the paper. And I would certainly recommend experimenting and trying out different mediums, because once you sort of get a handle on how watercolors work and how oils work and how pastels work, it really does give you some freedom to kind of play with the materials and, invent techniques and just really essentially have fun with the drawing. It's really ultimately about having fun, trying out something new that is exciting, that you're going to be interested in, and you're going to maintain that interest throughout the entire drawing. And I find that, using the pastels this way, for me is very exciting because it does remind me a lot of painting. I would also like to thank you for tuning in and watching the video. And if you have any comments, please feel free to leave them below. Also be sure to like the video and subscribe to my channel. For those of you who are familiar with my channel, you, I'm sure, have seen many of my previous videos where I discuss different types of drawing and painting techniques. I will actually be putting together a pastel portrait painting video where I will be discussing this technique in much greater depth. We will cover the entire portrait. I will talk about the drawing, laying in the structure of the face, and then how I would select my colors, and I'll go into more depth about materials. So that will be available on my online school at the beginning of next month. And the address for that is www.riverafineartstudios.thinkific.com. I will also include that address in the description below. So now I'm working my way into the inner portion of the eye, and I am just creating a base color for the iris. I used a fairly vibrant blue, and now I'm adding water to smooth that out. And one thing I want to stress here is that this is just a base color. So pretty much everything that you see so far that I've applied to the paper is the base color, not the final color. So what that means is that there are areas where the color is just perhaps a little bit too bright, and I will adjust that with the dry pastel. I will tone it down, and then there are other places where the color is a little bit on the duller side, and I will brighten the color or add more saturation, higher saturation or higher chroma to intensify the color. So that's a pretty important thing to realize, is that what you're seeing right now in the drawing is not the final color. This is a very layered process. There's a lot of time that goes into this. This first stage tends to look perhaps a little bit odd because the colors are not exactly the way they're going to end up as. So what you can see me doing right now is I am adjusting my blue by adding a little bit of orange, and that orange is going over it semi-opaquely. So the blue is still reflecting through, and it's making the orange look duller. So that's something else. We can sort of work with very opaque color by applying the pastel in a very heavy-handed way, or we can apply it a little bit lighter and let some of the color underneath reflect through, and in that way we're creating optical color. So now you see me going back over the orange with a little bit of charcoal pencil, and that is a way to adjust the value. So whenever I'm discussing color, there's really three components that I'm thinking of. I'm thinking of hue, and that is the particular type of color, so red, blue, orange, etc. I'm thinking of the chroma or the saturation. How vivid is that color? How pure is it? Or how dull is it? And then I'm thinking of value. How light or dark is that color? If I was to take a black and white photograph of the color, would it appear as a dark gray, or would it appear as a light gray? So those are really the things that are going on in my head as I'm working with color. And I'm constantly adjusting all three of those things simultaneously. So right now I really want to create some nice strong contrast between the iris and the pupil. So I'm going back over the pupil with my charcoal pencil. This is a soft charcoal pencil. It's a 4B, and it's giving me a really nice intense dark. Now I'm just adding little details, little points that are coming off of the edges of the pupil, sort of radiating out towards the outer edge of the iris, and I'm continuing to add those variations in the iris. This is a light-colored eye, so we see lots of variation, lots of little ridges and streaks, and now I'm just blending that with a very small chisel blender brush so it looks smooth and soft. I don't want those marks to be too distinctive or too harsh. I really like to think about the surface of things. So if we think about the different forms that we have here, the eyeball is a smooth, glassy form. And it's also moist, so it has a shine to it, versus something like the skin, which is porous. So whenever creating a hyper-realistic drawing, the texture is something that also is very important for me to try to capture. Now I am just adding little dashes of a very light color. This is just a slightly off-white pastel pencil. It's a Pitt pastel pencil. And I'm just going in and adding final little details, little streaks and so forth, to add more variation into the iris. So the eyeball is very blue. It's reflecting blue color, but I don't want to make the blue too strong. So I am just applying it with powder that I've added onto a double-sided shader. And in that way, I can apply the powder to the paper instead of applying the pastel directly. And that gives me a little bit of a fainter application of the color. And now I'm blending the a white pastel into that color to smooth it out. So I'm just finishing it off now with the white pastel. So that's going to lighten the value a little bit, but it's also going to smooth out the color. Now I am adding some pink directly on top of that color that I just smoothed out. And that's going to give another variation in the white of the eye. Now, when we're looking at the whites of the eye, we want to think about the fact that this is a surface that is very, very delicate, and directly beneath the white of the eye, we have blood vessels. So a lot of times you will see slightly warmer colors, like a hint of pink or a hint of yellow. So those are things that I'm adding, which is going to give it a little bit more of a lifelike quality. And I also added one very small little blood vessel. I did that with the shader on the right side there. Now I'm applying some blue powder to the left side of the eyeball and then smoothing it out once again with the white pastel. So the next step here is to add some additional details. Right now I have not included the eyelashes, so this is something that's going to be very important. The photo reference I'm using, she has very long eyelashes, so I'm just taking my charcoal pencil and I'm drawing them in, and I'm really looking for lots of variation. I've skipped ahead a little bit and I've sped the video up just because this part took quite a while. And what I'm looking for is variation in the thickness of the eyelashes and how they're grouped together. A lot of times I'll see them sort of grouped together in 3s or 4s, and also how it tapers as it moves from the root out to the tip. So once I've sort of drawn all those eyelashes in, I'm just going back over it with my shader and blending it a little bit to sort of soften the marks and perhaps, kind of make the edges a little bit blurrier here and there. Now I'm coming back with my light colored pastel pencil and I'm adding little highlights. So I'm seeing lots of highlights right at the root of the eyelashes. There is sort of a glistening quality. Perhaps there's a little bit more moisture in that area, but right where the plane changes, right where the bottom plane of that upper eyelid ends, that's where I'm seeing a lot of these little highlights. So this is a very subtle detail that can add so much realism to the picture. And it's very subtle, but it does make a huge difference. I always say to my students, really pay attention to the details. That can make a world of difference, and that can really tie the whole picture together. So if we're missing some of those subtleties and we're just not quite capturing it, it may end up looking more artificial. So really do pay attention to those details, especially in the final stages of the drawing. And now I am just adding some skin pores with some dry powder, which has been applied to my shader. And this is sort of the final step. I'm just going around and adding these final little details here and there. And this is the completed drawing. I hope you enjoyed the video, and please be sure to once again like and subscribe to my channel. Thank you very much for watching.